So, over the course of the last couple of decades, we've seen the degradation of our Fourth Amendment rights. Our privacy is being violated constantly. We learned about this even more with the Snowden revelations in 2013. And in 2017, one of the first things that President Donald Trump did was sign away our online privacy rights. But our online privacy and our data held by companies, our personal data held by companies, is now up for grabs in another way, thanks to something known as the Cloud Act. Now, according to Kristen Hauser of Futurism, while you were reeling from the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal, the US government quietly passed a piece of legislation that has far bigger implications for your data. The law is called the Clarifying Overseas Use of Data Cloud Act. It's basically an update to the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, a series of laws that regulate how U.S. law enforcement officials can access data stored overseas. Up until last week, the U.S. could only access data stored overseas through Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties, or MLATs. With the MLAT, two or more nations put in writing exactly how they are willing to help each other with legal investigations. The Senate votes on each MLAT, and it must receive two-thirds approval to pass. The Cloud Act gives the U.S. an alternative to MLATs. Through the Cloud Act, U.S. law enforcement officials at any level from local police to federal agents can force companies to turn over user data regardless of where the company stores the data. The Cloud Act also gives the executive branch the ability to enter into executive agreements with foreign nations, which could allow each nation to get its hands on user data stored in the other country, no matter the hosting nation's privacy laws. These agreements don't require congressional approval. So there's a lot going on there, and I understand if it's difficult to fully grasp the implications of this, but journalist Nima Singh Giuliani actually laid it out in a really good example. She states, what would happen if the Turkish government asked the US government for the Facebook messages of Turkish human rights activists that were stored on a server in the United States? Well, currently, there would be safeguards to stop the U.S. from giving up that information, but with the Cloud Act, the Attorney General and Jeff Sessions would both have all the power over that activist's digital privacy rights. So instead of having Congress decide what happens, whether or not the United States would turn over that data to the Turkish government, now it's just in the hands of the Attorney General and Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo and Jeff Sessions. So that is incredibly problematic. Now, someone who is a huge defender of the Fourth Amendment, Rand Paul, sounded off about this on Twitter, and he provided a quote from Nima's article that says, Congress should reject the Cloud Act because it fails to protect human rights or Americans' privacy, gives up their constitutional role, and gives far too much power to the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, the President, and foreign governments. But he followed up saying, but guess what? Congress can't vote to reject the Cloud Act because it just got stuck onto the Omnibus with no prior legislative action or review. And guess what? Before we even learned about what this was, before we could fully grasp all of the implications of the Cloud Act, it was passed, and Donald Trump already signed it into law. So at this point, there's absolutely nothing we can do to stop it. It's now enacted, and the Fourth Amendment is being eroded even further. Our data is even more vulnerable. Our data is now in the hands of Mike Pompeo and Jeff Sessions. So even if we can't really do anything about it, I still think it's important that you know what your government is doing to violate your civil liberties. I think that when it comes to data, we have to do everything in our power to safeguard it. But now, Jeff Sessions and Mike Pompeo can tell tech companies that they need to turn over data regardless of where that data is stored. It's incredibly problematic, and unfortunately, nobody knew about this really. I mean, I saw a little bit about this on Reddit, but by and large, the media didn't talk about this, and that's incredibly troublesome because this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So if we're not going to respect our Constitution, why do we even have it? I mean, it makes no sense. This was a bill that they didn't give anyone a choice to debate it. The American people didn't have time to react. It was just stuck into a bill and then passed. That's what they do in Congress because they know that if they allow this legislation any time in the sunlight, any sort of debate whatsoever, the American people would unequivocally reject it. Hence why they have to do things like this. They have to sneak really unpopular types of legislation that takes away our civil liberties into omnibus spending bills in order to make sure it gets passed. But again, we can't do anything now. It's passed. Trump signed it into law. So you have the details. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do about it now.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.